and welcome everyone. Today's webinar is brought to you by NC State's Industry Extension Services. I'm going to turn it over now to our speaker, Angela Barger, who is an improvement specialist with IES. Angela?
Thanks, Susan. Hello and welcome everybody. As Susan mentioned, my name is Angela Barger. I've been assisting companies and organizations with the ISO 14001 standard for almost 20 years now. And today I'm going to talk you through the recent changes that were issued. So it'll be helpful for you if you have a copy of the standard, whether it's the 2015 version or the 26 version, but just to have that open in front of you so you can kind of reference what I'm going through. Um, if you don't have any experience with the standard, this might be a little in the weeds for you. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully you'll still get some good information out of this. For those of you who are going to be needing that certificate of attendance for the webinar, there's a couple things you need to know. One, you must participate in this webinar live. Unfortunately, we can't issue certification for those who actually review the recording at a later date. That said, we are recording this. It will be available for you to go back and reference or to share with others who might need the information. And the second thing you might need is that in order to get the certificate, you have to participate until the end of the webinar. So you can't just be on here, get the link, and then get a certificate. You actually have to make it to the end. Zoom actually does track that for us, so we'll be verifying that. But we're going to share a link that's going to ask for your name and your email address just to make sure that we have what you want on that certificate and where to send it to. So that we can create those and get them out to you. Please be patient with us. It's going to take a little bit of time because we had a lot of people sign up for this webinar. So our poor admin, who we adore, will be working on that over the course of the next week or so to get those out to you. So just be patient about getting those certificates if you request one. Okay. Oh, and one other thing you should do is when you sign up, sign that information in that link, make sure you use the same email address that you used to register for today's event. That way we can do that confirmation piece. Again, since we have so many folks online today, I'm going to ask we keep everybody on mute. Please feel free to type those questions into the Q&A. I'm going to try and pause after each clause of the standard. For some questions, we'll take one or two after each clause, and then we'll take, a larger chunk at the end, just so that we can keep the webinar moving. So, with all that housekeeping done, let's dive into these changes. So as most of you know, ISO issued an update to the ISO 14001 standard in April of this year. That means that the 2015 version of the standard is in process of being completely replaced by the 2026 version. If you are currently registered to the ISO 14001 2015, then you have a 3-year transition period. You're going to need to work with your registrar to determine the best timing for you to do this upgrade. Typically, the most cost-effective way for you to do that is to go ahead and make the upgrade during your next recertification audit that occurs within that 3-year period. So whether that is 6 months or on that 3rd year, that's typically the most cost-effective way to do it. As you'll see, the changes are not terribly complex. So, even if your audit is coming up soon, I think you'll be able to make any needed adjustments. For those of you who are not yet registered to the standard, you should be looking to do that through the 2026 version for your initial certification. There may be some of you out there who are kind of in the middle of the certification round. You've already done your Scope 1 audit, and you haven't done your Scope 2 yet. Talk to your registrar about what makes the most sense in order for you to achieve your certification without adding a bunch of additional extra cost for another audit for you. So that's all there is about, the changes in timing. It's pretty straightforward and standard what they're doing here. So what changed? So as I mentioned, the changes this time are fairly minor. That doesn't mean that it's not important to make those changes, but in the grand scheme of things, this shouldn't take a huge effort, unlike when, the entire structure of the standard changed between the 2004 and the 2015 version. 26 version is placing more emphasis on sustainability. Oops, there we go. Um, there was an amendment issued in 2024 regarding you needed to make a decision whether or not climate change is a relevant issue for your organization. So this amendment has been incorporated into this new version of the standard, in addition to other sustainability issues such as biodiversity and ecosystem health. Okay. The new version also provided more clarification on life cycle. Though that, it is exclusively done basically through your notes and additions to the appendix. There's not any new requirements in the standard around this, but there is more emphasis on it and a little bit more clarification for you. So just be aware of that. Because ISO is an international organization and these standards are translated into many languages, they've discovered over time that some of the words that they used don't necessarily translate to mean what was intended in all of the languages. So, to that end, they've also made some minor wording updates that don't change the intended requirement, but it does change the wording that was used. The biggest of these is changing from the need to fulfill requirements. Typically, that's around your compliance obligations. So instead of saying you need to fulfill your compliance obligations, it now says you need to meet your compliance obligations. Again, very minor wording change. The intent is still the same, but just be aware that throughout the standard, you're going to see that little tweak. Additionally, the previous version of your standard uses the words maintain and retain for documented information. This one wasn't a wording change due to translation issues. It's more a change in focus. So instead of using maintain and retain as document information, they're now saying that documented information needs to be available. So that means available to your auditors, available to whoever needs that information when they need it, which implies that you still need to maintain and retain information. Okay. So this is meant to ensure any documentation you have within your system is available. Okay, that's the big change there. It's not enough to just keep your records. They need to be accessible for review. It's not enough to have a written procedure. It needs to be available for reference by the people required to meet it. For organizational purposes, the standard also reordered some of its subclauses to make the flow of work more fluid. So we'll talk through those when we get to those points. And finally, probably the biggest change in the standard is they added a totally new subclause in 6.3, which is called planning of changes. And again, we'll step through that when we get there. Okay. As a reminder, 14,001 standard is based on the plan, do, check, act model for continual improvement. You might recognize this diagram from the introduction to the standard in 2015. In the 2026 version, they've actually modified it to make it clearer on how the clauses of the standard actually interrelate with the PDCA model. So all of that gray space is clause 4, the context of the organization, because it is the basis of everything that occurs within your management system. All of that information feeds into your scope, which is again part of clause 4. And you can see that contains everything in the white area. Okay, so your scope is what's in that white area. And then remember that you only must manage those things within your scope. All right. Clause 5, which is leadership, is in the middle because the requirements of this clause are central to the success of your system, just as when you don't have leadership support for anything you're trying to accomplish at your organization, it can collapse. Well, that's true for your management systems as well. Clause 6, which is planning, conveniently falls in the plan section of the PDCA model, whereas do contains both the support and operations functions of clauses 7 and 8. Check has your performance evaluation, okay, which is clause 9, including internal audits, monitoring and measurement, management review. And then finally, clause 10 is your improvement piece. That's your portion of the PDCA model. And that informs the next planning phase. So, any questions on anything before we dive into the auditable clauses? Okay. In that case, we'll move on. We're going to start with clause 4. So, this is context of the organization. So, as I mentioned, ISO has incorporated and expanded upon the 2024 amendment to determine if climate change is relevant to your organization. You still have to determine whether or not what your internal and external issues are that may affect you or that you may affect. These are ones that are related to your environmental management system specifically. And you still have to include environmental conditions, but it now specifically calls out pollution levels, availability of natural resources, biodiversity, and ecosystem health, in addition to that climate change requirement. All of these should be considered. Don't let the wording that they used, such as, fool you into thinking that you can ignore this change. The intent is to take these into account when you're evaluating your context. So that's why they were included in the standards language and not just put into a note or in the appendix. Okay. They were already kind of there in the appendix in 2015. Now they have moved it into the standard itself. Okay. So my suggestion, it is that during your next management review or whenever you typically review your business issues, discuss these specific topics, decide if any of them apply, and if there's anything else that you need to do to address them. Okay, so that's the change in 4.1. So they've taken what was in 2015 and that 2024 amendment, and then they added it all together into 26. I really wish they hadn't used the word such as because that makes it sound softer than it actually is. You need to actually take into account those items that they specifically call out. It may be that none of these apply to you or only some of them apply to you, and that's fine, but they want you to look and see if that is the case. All right, moving on to section 4.2, and this is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. It's substantially the same, but now after determining who your interested parties are and what their requirements are, now you need to now when you determine, which of those will become compliance obligations, it clearly states that you must address those items in your system. That was always implied, but it's now very clearly stated. Okay. There were also 2 notes added to this subclause. Remember that notes are not requirements. They're there for clarification and guidance. But the first note here is reinforcing that focus on sustainability topics from 4.1 that we just talked about. And the second note was previously discussed in the appendix, but now is up front to remind you that if you agree to meet a requirement, whether that is a customer requirement, the expected voluntary recognition program, or a local community organization's land usage requests, that these are now becoming compliance obligations. And you must not only meet these requirements, but ensure you have controls in place to do so consistently. Okay. All right. So moving on, section 4.3. This is determining the scope of your environmental management system. There is the addition that your scope needs to cover the entire life cycle of your activities, products, and services. Okay, so if your scope doesn't already kind of include that entire life cycle, you might want to, just verify that your scope is still accurate and meets the standard the way it's written. And this is of those things that you have control or influence over. Okay. Notice this is not just the life cycle of your product. Okay, this could be your buildings, your services that are provided at a customer site, or any other of your activities. From, receiving those raw materials all the way through the end of your product or the end of that building or that piece of equipment. Okay. Still doesn't mean assessing your complete life cycle, doing that numerical evaluation or whatever. But you do need to consider the stages where you have any influence or control. This subclass is also the first place that we see that change from maintained or retained documented information to it must be available, right? Your scope must be available as documented information, both internally and to those to your interested parties. Oh, and there weren't any changes at all to subclause 4.4. So yay, there's nothing for you to do there. Any questions on clause 4 at all?
Hey, Angela, there
Yes,
there
ma'am.
was one question from Manar, I believe I'm saying that correctly, asking what documentation is needed as support in section 4. Is there anything? I know you mentioned management review. Is there any other documentation that would be helpful?
Yeah, so the only required documentation here is your scope, right? So that is the one place that it says it must be available as documented information. However, you must have evidence that you have done the things that are required. And so, like you mentioned in 4.1 and 4.2, you want to talk about those changes during management review, and you can capture those discussions and the outcomes from that discussion during management review. And that's typically the way we see those handled. Some people may have documented their issues from 4.1 and their interested parties from 4.2 within a manual or some other document, in which case you need to go back and make sure you update those as well. But the only required documentation in all of 4.1 by the standard for that element is your scope. Any other?
Awesome.
Yep,
Thank you.
absolutely. All right. So moving on, if that's the last one for 4.3, feel free, if you think of something later, throw it in the Q&A. We'll hit it at the end. So 5, this is leadership. Here, ISO emphasizing stronger leadership accountability for that sustainability push. But they didn't make a whole lot of changes here. So here in 4.5.1, the only change was to letter I, and that is to make it broader. So instead of only being required to support other managers in demonstrating that leadership within the EMS, it now has taken out the word management. So it is leadership's responsibility to support anyone, so any relevant role in demonstrating that leadership in their areas of responsibility. And remember, this is specific to the EMS. It may not say it every single time that it says you must do blah, 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 but the scope of this document is an environmental management system. And so when it says supporting other relevant roles to demonstrate leadership, they're talking about within your environmental management system. Okay. 5.2 for policy, we have our first change in wording from fulfill to meet. So beyond that translation issue, the intent is that you commit to always meeting your compliance obligations, not just demonstrating that you fulfill them when an auditor requests that information, but that you're meeting them at all points. Again, we also have the updated requirement that the policy is available, not just maintained as documented information. And additionally, there was a note added with some guidance on other specific commitments that may be considered when developing your environmental policy. Again, it's a note, it's not a requirement, but they put notes inside of the standard to give you a little bit more guidance and influence on those things that they really want to stress versus putting them in the appendix where it's just kind of if you need to understand what they were talking about, why they put things together the way they did, what something means more than just a short definition. That's what the appendix is for. For the record, you don't have to change your policy or any other documents to have the words meet or available in them. If you still say fulfill in your policy, that's fine, as long as the intention is the same. Okay, so you might want to change it to meet just because it's, an easier word to digest for folks. But it's not a requirement that you do that as long as the intention is that you are going to meet your compliance obligations. All right. Okay. So the next section, 5.3, had two very minor changes. The first was the removal of organizational in the title. So you might have roles and responsibilities that are required by someone outside of your organization that impacts your environmental management system. For example, you hire somebody to perform your internal audits for you. Well, they're not an organizational role, but it's still something that can definitely affect your EMS. So they just kind of broadened it by taking out that organizational word. The other change was purely wording, right? So it was changing this international standard to this document. Okay, it was nitpicky. Again, just so you're aware that little niggly change was there. That's it for clause 5. So are there any questions on any of the leadership stuff? Okay, moving on. So clause 6, planning. There are some more significant changes here, mostly in the organization piece of it. So hang on. It's going to sound a little confusing at first, but I think we can make it through this. So clause 6.1 was reordered to make it flow better. So instead of telling you to define your risks and opportunities, then being specific about how, it now walks you through each one of those specific things first, then defines what wasn't already covered. So basically, what ISO did here is split 611 into a much shortened general clause, which remains 6.11, and then put the rest of that element from 2015 into 6.1.4 for 2026. And that new subclause is called risks and opportunities, while the initial 611 is called general. Okay. They moved planning actions from 614 to 615. So they just pushed it down one. So it still falls after the definition of what your issues are. We're going to go through other changes with each of the subclauses. And I know this seems complicated and unnecessary, but it really does make the workflow a little bit smoother in this particular element. All right, so 611. Here you can see the specifics of where things went when they split it up. So in the first paragraph, the references were changed in order to meet the new format. Makes sense, right? So instead of referring to the old places, now it's where it actually is. In the second paragraph, in the 2015 version, was moved to section 6.1.4. So as the first paragraph in 2026. So what you that second paragraph in 2015 is now 6.1.4. The third paragraph about defining your potential emergencies, that's now part of your environmental aspects in section 612. So it's still there, it's still in 6, but now it's part of the aspects and impacts piece. And then that last paragraph of 611, it's important to note it's been reworded to read the process for 612 to 615 shall be available as documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence they are carried out as planned. Okay. So if you don't already have documented processes for your environmental aspects, your compliance obligations, your risks and opportunities, or planning actions to address those, here in 611, it's clearly stated that you're going to need enough information documented that you can carry out the actions needed as planned. Okay. So just note that that's there now. Okay, so diving into 612, your environmental aspects, you see the addition of defining your potential emergencies here, what we just talked about. It's now contained here in this subclause. It makes sense, since you have to take potential emergencies into account when you're determining your aspects and impacts that they would put it here. The requirement didn't change, just moved. And speaking of things to take into account when determining your aspects and impacts. This standard specifically calls out normal conditions now. You may not have realized it didn't say normal before, but it didn't. It did say abnormal, but normal was always assumed to be a part of this. I would be willing to bet that all of you had already looked at normal functions when you were creating your aspects and impacts list, but now it is specifically called out in case you were trying to, say, hey, but the standard didn't say. Anyway, so you still look at the change. Oh, see. Yeah. So you still look at changes, right? So that's also another piece that you're looking at. So you've got normal and abnormal, and you still look at the changes. The wording's the same, but they just moved where it was in the standard again. So instead of it being in A, it's now in B. Um, and then you are referencing that new planning of change clause. So that's 6.3. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get there. And since we added normal and abnormal on the same line, they bumped the emergency situations to a line of its own. And now that's C. Okay. So honestly, the changes here are pretty minor. You've already were probably considering normal anyway. And otherwise, it's just rearranging the order of where they have it in this element. Okay. Okay. 612, we're still going with aspects here. So again, we have the change from maintain to available as documented information. But what has to be documented, those environmental aspects and impacts, your significant aspects, and the criteria for determining which ones are significant, that didn't change. That's still the requirement. There wasn't anything new added. So you have to have those three things documented. There's also a note that they added to 612, and note 1 gives some guidance on your life cycle perspective. Basically, it states that a life cycle perspective, including consideration of your environmental aspects and impacts at each life cycle stage. The life cycle stage includes acquisition of raw materials, design, production, transportation, delivery, use, end of life treatment, and final disposal. So look at each stage and determine if you have any control or influence over any of the environmental impacts that occur during those. If you do, then those items need to be included in your list and evaluated for significance. Okay. Again, this was always true. They've just given a little bit more emphasis and clarification by adding that note inside of the standard. Okay. So moving to 6.3, this is your compliance obligations. And just a reminder, this is both your legal and your other requirements. This is the only standard I work with where they call it compliance obligations. Every other standard still calls it legal and other. I actually prefer that language. I think it's less confusing because a lot of people see compliance and the only thing they think about is legal, but that is not what ISO means. They mean legal and other requirements. Okay. Here, your only wording changes is from maintained to available as documented information. Okay. That's it for your compliance obligations. All right. Okay, so this is the new subclause that was added to move all of the stuff that used to be in 611 to 614. All right. What used to be that second paragraph in the 2015 version is now the first paragraph here. Also, when it used to just refer to either the section of the standard or a number, or now they include both the section of the standard by number and by name. It's not one or the other. So you can kind of see in blue how that changed. So where it used to just say issues referred to in 4.1, now it says the external and internal issues referred to in 4.1. Just clarification, nothing new needs to be done. Okay. And then finally, what used to be 6.14 was bumped down to 615. There's no substantive changes here, just the addition of the reference to those related sections of the standard instead of just the terms, environmental aspects, compliance obligations, and risks and opportunities. Okay. I'm gonna pause here, just in case, because of all the, confusing movement of things, to see if there are any questions, and just to hopefully alleviate any confusion I may have given you by talking through all of that. Anything, Adrian?
Angela, there is one question. I don't know if we have time to address it. They're asking to list the stages you called out for the life cycle 612.
Oh, they want me to go through them again?
Yes.
Give me one more second. Find it again, so I don't say them differently. To find them. Where did I put them? All right. All right, it's inside my presentation, so I have to find them again.
Okay, no worries. And if we need to answer after or type it in, we can do that. That's fine.
Sure. I mean, I can run through them without telling you exactly, reading them off my slide. Um, so basically, it's raw materials, right? So receiving of the raw materials, ordering the raw materials. If you are one of the folks that actually, um, you know, produces those raw materials, that's where you start. Then it is um, production, transportation, delivery, um, end of life treatment if there is anything needed, and then disposal. Okay. And if you happen to have design, that would also be one of those. So raw materials design or design raw materials, depending on which way your system works. Okay. Hopefully I got them all. Sorry. I wish I could find my list again so I could read them
No,
out exactly like I had
that's
them, but
perfect. And Brennan dropped them in the chat for us, so we're
oh,
good.
thank you, Brennan.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
All
sounds
right.
good.
All right. So moving on to 6.2. This is your objectives and planning to achieve them. These didn't really change other than, the requirement to make them available instead of just maintaining them. Okay. So whatever you did before for your objectives, this should still be fine, right? You just need to make sure that the information is available as documented information. All right. Now, here's your totally new subclause. I finally added a clause specific to management of change within the ISO 14001 standard. Managing planned changes was always part of the standard, but it was and still is included within multiple other clauses. So ISO created this clause to emphasize its importance. And so here's what it says, right? So when the organization determines the need for changes that affect or can affect the environmental management system, the changes shall be carried out in a planned manner. The changes shall be managed to ensure that the organization can achieve the intended outcomes of its environmental management system. That's it. That's all this big major subclause says, right? And the reason is it was always there. It just wasn't its own special clause. All of the requirements for planning of change existed and still exist at other points. So, in addition to having this planning of change, specific language here with the shalls, it also gave you two notes. So, let's go through those notes. The first discusses, briefly that the need for change can come from either internal or external sources. And then it references the appendix or the annex for examples. So here's an excerpt from that section of the appendix. Many of these things you probably already think about, when you're planning for changes within your EMS. Those new or updated processes, equipment, or facilities, for example. But down at the bottom, read their example H. It talks about business disruptions from all kinds of things, including supply chain issues, natural disasters, and even war. So, things you may not have considered when planning your EMS initially. So, remember that in most places in the standard, it talks about planned changes and also mitigating effects from unintended changes. So H to me talks a lot about those unintended changes that you might have to do some mitigation around. So this is in Annex A 6.3. So you can go into your standard and read each one of those individually. But I just wanted to point out that, you know, the note is really short, but the information that it's talking about is much longer if you go into the annex and read what it's talking about. True for two. So note two, the second note, in this new subclause references the fact that, this was always a requirement. Then it sends you back to the appendix to see all those references. Again, here's the excerpt from the appendix that's related to this note. Basically, what they're saying is, if you're already meeting these planning requirements, like we told you to, we wouldn't have to call this out. But since some of you aren't, we're going to make it clear. If you're already meeting these planning requirements, then there isn't anything special that needs to be done in order to update your system. But if you need some clout in order to be allowed at the table during those planning phases of new projects, this is the clause that you can point to say, hey, we need to be part of the planning process at the earliest stages. Okay. So you see here all the places that it already was and still is. So you've got your environmental aspects has a requirement for, planned changes, internal communications, control of documented information, operational control, internal audits, and your nonconformity and corrective action plans. All of these within them have a reference to managing your planned changes, okay, and mitigating unintended changes. All right, so that's it for 6. Any questions on anything from clause 6 that we haven't already hit? All right. Clear as mud. All right, so next we got clause 7. This is support. Nothing really substantial here changed, so we're going to fly through this. So there was no change at all in 7.1 for resources. It reads exactly the same way. 7.2, the only change was from fulfill to meet regarding your compliance obligations, and from retain to available on the documentation piece for evidence of competence. Okay. So simple. Then similarly in 7.3 and 7.4, we have those wording updates from fulfill to meet and retain to available. Super easy. You can see those here. And then 7.5 is even less substantial in that there was a wording change within a note. So again, fulfillment to meeting. And they're updating the subheader here to also clarify that they meant creating and updating documented information. I'm not sure what else you would be creating underneath the documented information clause, but they just put that clarification in there, and that's it. For clause 7, super simple, no really substantial changes here at all. Any questions?
Angela, Michael is asking if you could go back a couple slides, but I'm not sure what what he's asking. So Michael, if you could, I don't know if you're just trying to see what it says. If you have a specific question, just drop it in the Q&A. Yeah, sorry, Angela. Thank you.
No, you're fine. So I went back to the beginning of 7 because I'm not sure when that came in. So here's this. They're probably just trying to capture what the changes were. Here's
Possibly.
7.3 and 7.4.
Okay, he's saying was unclear on the first set of changes in change 6.
And change in 6.1. So they just
Okay.
rearranged a bunch of things.
hmm
I can go back over that at the end.
That sounds good. That's fine. 6.1, that's what he meant. Yes, at the end would be fine. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, moving on. So clause 8, this one is operations. All right. Here in 8.1, there's a clarification that's important to note here, and this might take a little bit more effort and thought than some of the other tweaks in the standard. I mean, little wording changes or, take them or leave them. But in paragraph 3, of 8.1, the standard actually used to reference control or influence of outsourced processes. And this language has been modified and it actually broadens what was originally managed by your organization. So instead of just outsourced processes, you now need to ensure that externally provided processes, products, or services that are relevant to the intended outcomes of your environmental management system. So now instead of just those processes, you have to control products and services that may have an environmental impact as well. So even if they are done offsite by a contractor, if it affects your operations, your products, your services, then you need to have some control or influence over that. That might be done in contracts, through vendor site visits, certifications, or any other way that you actually control your contractors and externally provided materials and services. It's up to you how you're going to do it. Just be sure that you're looking at your supply chain. Here too, we have that change from maintain documented information to, having that information available. A big thing here is that change from just outsourced processes to externally provided processes, products, or services that are relevant to your outcomes, your intended outcomes of the environmental management system. So, you don't necessarily have to worry about anything that's not going to affect you environmentally. But if you have a process that you send stuff out to be done to your product and it comes back to you, and that process is environmentally intensive, let's say it's a coding process or something like that, then you need to make sure that that process is controlled by your vendor. Okay. But also it could, your chemical, if you're going to bring chemicals on site, that you have a process for making sure that those are the chemicals that meet your requirements, for your environmental management system, right? So whether that is things that you use on a regular basis within your production, or whether that is, folks bring stuff on site to test or whatever, you just need to have your fingers on, how is this going to affect us? Do we need to control it? How do we control it? What criteria do we have? And how is that communicated, and how do we control it once, folks are aware of what we're asking them to do for us? Make sense? All right. And then 8.2, just a couple little tweaks here. Mainly, there's the update to the reference where you define your potential emergencies. Instead of it being in 611, it's now in 612. And a couple wording changes. So the first replaced identified with determined when discussing your potential emergencies. And the other one, once again, it's a change from maintain to available for the documented information requirement. And that is clause 8. Right? Any questions at all for either 8.1 or 8.2? Okay. So moving on to clause 9. This is performance evaluation. So in 911, this is your monitoring and measurement analysis. They've combined the requirements for evaluating your environmental performance and the effectiveness of your EMS into a single sentence. So whereas it used to be in 2 different places within the standard, it's now been combined into a single one. Okay, so that's why they deleted paragraph 4 in order to avoid that redundancy. Okay, so they just added it up into that first paragraph, right? Easy enough. Then in the second paragraph of 911, ISO's added a requirement that you not only determine what needs to be monitored and measured, but also what needs to be analyzed, which makes sense, right? You're not going to analyze it unless you've determined what you need to analyze. And again, in that last paragraph, we have that requirement for documented information to be available, not just retained. Okay. Then moving into 912, this is the evaluation of compliance piece. This also now has the usual and expected wording updates from fulfillment to meeting and retain to available. It's quick and easy, right? Again, we're not really changing what you needed to do. It's just changing the wording that's being used and making sure that that information is available and not just, kept. Then we move into another area that you might need a little bit more thought. So this is in your internal auditing program. So 922. It now requires that you not only define your criteria and scope for each audit, but also the audit objective. Okay. So according to ISO 19011, which is the guidance for auditing, which also was recently updated, by the way, in case you have a copy of that and you need a new version, the audit objectives define what's to be accomplished by an individual audit. And it can include any of the following. So A is determination of the extent of the conformity of the management system to be audited or parts of it with audit criteria. So are you meeting the standard? And then evaluation of the capability of the management system to assist the organization in meeting relevant statutory and regulatory requirements and other requirements to which the organization is committed. So that's, the evaluation of compliance piece, right? Are you meeting your legal and other requirements? Then you've got C, which is evaluation of the effectiveness of the management system in meeting its intended outcomes. So not only are you doing what you said you were going to do, but is it actually accomplishing what you meant for it to accomplish? D is finding opportunities for improvement in your management system. That one is pretty self-explanatory. E, evaluation of the suitability and adequacy of the management system with respect to the context and strategic direction of your organization, right? So if you remember, in the standard where it says you have to determine if it's suitable and adequate, then that's that piece too. So you're looking to see if the system is still meeting what your needs, right? And then the last, nope, so there's two more. F, so that's evaluation of the capability of the management system to establish and achieve objectives, and then effectively address your risks and opportunities in a changing context, right? So if you have a bunch of stuff going on, are you keeping up with all of that? That's the whole management of change piece, right?
Angela, sorry to interrupt. There are a
Yes.
few folks that cannot see the letter F you're referencing. Is that on another
Oh,
slide?
no, so this is from 11. I didn't throw it on the slide. I'm sorry. I'm reading them to you.
Got you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Sorry about that. Um, and then G is the consideration of any sector-specific management system audit standards. Okay. So basically, what this is saying is that you have to now, instead of just having the scope of your audits, right? You also have to have that objective. And this is examples of what those objectives may be. So typically your objectives are to determine whether or not your system is meeting your requirements. You're looking for opportunities for improvement. You're comparing it to your own requirements as well as the always the case, but now you actually just have to define it within your audit program. Make sense?
So
All right.
just to clarify, Angela, is it only A that changed here?
Yes. So
Okay,
in that third paragraph, audit objectives, it now says you define the audit objective as well as that criteria and scope for each audit. Objectives was not there before. It's the only
perfect.
thing that changed in that particular element. All right. Again, 9.2, like everywhere else, we have that change from retain to available on the documented information piece. But in addition to that, it now lists the need for evidence that the audit program has been implemented. Okay, you always had to have evidence of your program and your results, but now it is also added that you have to have evidence of the implementation of the audit program. So it's not enough to just have a program. You actually have to show how you are meeting the requirements within that program. Okay. So that might be, lists of who your auditors are and which things that they can actually audit. If you have a schedule of when your audits are going to occur, that you show that they are occurring on those dates. It's not just, having a calendar and having your audit findings. That's not enough anymore. You need to actually have a full, evidence of your program and that it's working. Okay. Sorry, my PowerPoint just blinked and went away. All right, you're doing my notes. I apologize. So that's 9.2. You guys have heard the changes for your internal auditing. Again, just like everywhere else, that change from retained to available is there. But now, you have to have that evidence of the program too. All right. So 9.3, this is management review. This is the general. It's the same as your 2015. So the required inputs and outputs didn't really change. It now meets the same structure as the other management systems. So if you have a 9001 system or a 45,001 system, they're now going to be have those same subclauses. Whereas in the 2015 version, they just pushed everything into a single clause for 14,001. So 931 is the same as the first paragraph of the 2015 version of the standard. All of the inputs to management review are now listed in 9.3.2. Okay. And what they did here is they just removed the word consideration and now made all of your inputs have to be included. So instead of saying, you shall consider these things, it now says the management review inputs shall include. Okay. So that means everything that they list has to be part of your management review now. The inputted changes in your needs and expectations of interested parties has now been narrowed down to those that are relevant for EMS. That was always the assumption when we were looking at management review, but it's pointed out here. Okay. Then 9.3.3. That third subclause, the word outputs was changed to results. They want to actually see you making progress. So instead of inputs and outputs, you now have inputs and results for your management review. And of course, there's the change from fulfillment to meeting and retain to available. So just be aware that that's just throughout the standard. Any questions on 9? I'm sorry for the technology glitch. No? Okay, moving on. Clause 10, this is improvement. We're finally here on this last clause. Awesome. All right, in the 15 version, both 10.1 and 10.3 addressed your continual improvement, in very short paragraphs. So for the 2026 version, what they did was they consolidated those two subclauses into a single subclause, and then they made that 10.1 continual improvement. Okay, so it now has all of that information into that single one, and it reads the organization shall continually improve your suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of your management system to enhance your environmental performance by determining the opportunities for improvement. So, and those come from clause 9 and 10. So clause 9, right, that's your management review, your internal audits, your monitoring and measurement, right? 10.2, that's your corrective and preventive or your corrective action. Sorry, that was really old throwback. We don't have preventive action specifically called out anymore. So you're looking for in those sections, and you're implementing any necessary actions to achieve the intended outcomes of your management system. All right. So that is now your continual improvement element. And then 10.2 did not really change. So your nonconformity and corrective action is the same. The only change here, again, is that retain to available, right? Any questions on anything we've covered so far? All right. There have been some changes to the annex. Unlike the main clauses, these are pretty lengthy in some cases. It provides additional clarification, descriptions, guidance on sustainability, on life cycle, on that change management structure. And then, updates to terminology that makes it align with other management systems within the ISO family. I've always said that the ISO 14001 Annex was one of the best things that I've ever read when it comes to ISO 14000 standard. Because it really gives you an understanding of what the technical committee was thinking with each clause. If you want to understand clause 4.1, then you look in the appendix at A 4.1. If you need information on the new clause 6.3, then you look in the annex at A 6.3. It goes through the entire standard. It doesn't leave any of the elements out. So if you have a question on any one of the elements, you can just go to the annex and say A, and then whatever the clause number is, and it's there. And that's helpful. Some other standards also have helpful annexes, but they'll say no additional information here. And 14001 does not do that. Every single one of the elements has something addressed. Okay, so what are your next steps? Now you know what the changes are. They're not like super, in-depth, hard to do. Let's talk about what those may be. So if you haven't already, you want to make sure you purchase a copy of your updated standard. Remember it's copyrighted material, so you never want to have an unofficial copy, especially during an audit, but ever. It's offered both on paper and electronically, as well as in multiple languages at various partners, of ISO and across the web. Step 2, you want to perform a gap analysis and see if you're missing any of these new or updated requirements. And then, use your base your transition plan on those gaps that you found. Don't forget, some internal communication and awareness work may be needed, including making sure your internal auditors have been trained on the updates. Make sure you have that you've updated your system with those key changes. Review the context to determine applicability of natural resources, availability, climate change, biodiversity, and ecohealth. That's, one of those big key changes from the standard. Revise your scope to make sure it reflects that life cycle approach if you need to. Separate your emergency situations from your abnormal conditions and your aspects and impacts analysis if you have them grouped together in that way. Ensure the management of changes is addressed. This might be a good opportunity if you don't have a formal management of change process to get one of those in place or to insert yourself into one that already exists that might be on the business operations side. Make sure they understand that the environmental piece is important to be involved at the upfront. And revise your operational control processes to extend to suppliers and partners. Some more changes, a few of those key changes. You want to update your internal auditing process to define those objectives in addition to your scope and criteria that should already be within your program. Document your internal audit program, your plan, with more than just, a schedule of what your audits are going to be or when they're going to happen. Update your management reviews to restructure into those 3 subclauses, your inputs, your process, and your results. And during that management review, talk about the changes to the standard so that, management is aware there's been an update and what those updates are, and particularly around 4.1, where they need to understand, that you have to have that conversation. about the specific clauses around sustainability, and whether or not they apply to you. Then you want to strengthen your root cause analysis and improvement tracking between your performance evaluation findings and continual improvement. Okay. You want to make sure that once you find issues that you are fixing them and then, taking credit for those as continual improvement, right? You're also looking for opportunities for improvement that haven't made it to the point of corrective actions for continual improvement, but you want to start, tracking those. Make sure you address changes to the standard during your next management review, as I mentioned. And then once you've made updates and trained your auditors, then you want to complete an internal audit to the 2026 version of the standard and make any corrections that are needed as necessary. And then last, in this list, but probably something you should do sooner rather than later, and is to contact your registrar, discuss the transition time frame and what their expectations are of you, and when they expect those changes to be made. All right. So, any final questions? Anything I need to go back and talk about more?
Yeah, Angela, there's several questions have come in, and so thank you for these. I'll go through them in the order they were received. So the first one was around the risk assessment. So the question is, could you help explain what counts as sufficient proof of evaluation for reporting climate change for qualitative risk assessments and quantitative data?
So specifically talking about
Uh-huh.
evaluating the risk of climate change.
Correct.
Again, ISO 14001, it doesn't require that you do that big formal risk analysis around climate change, just that you have discussed it. You've taken into account if your company, or organization um, finds that it is an important issue for you, then depending on how it affects you will inform what you need to do as far as showing what the risk is. So if the risk is that you'll have supply chain issues, then that's going to fall to, okay, so what do we do to mitigate the risk of this supply chain? Do we find additional suppliers who can help with that? Do we find more local folks to reduce the transportation issues, that kind of thing? So really, it depends on what risk would be possible from that to you. So it's hard to answer just generally because everybody's going to have a different potential impact from it. But they're not asking for you to do a um, you know, full-blown risk, FMEA or something around it.
Mhm,
Although,
mhm,
if your system is that complicated that you need that, then do that. Okay.
mhm. What about related to 4.1 and 4.2 as proof that you've looked at
Ooh.
climate change?
So, if you're looking for documentation of that, I would say put it into, if you have it documented somewhere, then you're going to have a edit of that. You're going to put it into you're going to change that document and update your um, blog. Or if you don't already have it documented somewhere, then you're going to talk about it during management review and you're going to document it during management review. You should have it documented during management review anyway, because remember when you have changes, you have to bring those up. That's one of the inputs to management review. And you also have to have inputs, which so you have minutes or some other way of collecting that data. So it's going to be during management review. So I would use either what you've already got or in combination with your management review. That make sense?
Great. Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, for 6.3, the planning for changes,
Mm-hmm.
how should they consider EMS impact? What assessment should be considered there?
Planning of changes. So
Uh-huh.
anything that can potentially change. So again, if you look at your annex 6.3, these are the potential changes. You need to plan for how the EMS could be impacted by these potential changes. And again, depending on what the change is, the impact is going to be different. So what some folks have is like um, a form that they go through that says, okay, this is the new project. These are the potential impacts it could have. It could need permits. It could, might need new chemicals. And then what those things do that could, contribute to your hazardous waste, you need to look at all of that from the beginning before you make the change. However, there's also that little piece about you also have to mitigate unintended changes. So this, business disruption for whatever reason, those you want to capture what the change was and how you mitigated for those changes. So that can just be a record that you keep, showing what you did to control for those changes, whether you meant for them to happen or they happened, you know, and then you had to deal with them. Did that answer that question?
I believe so. If not, feel free to drop that in the chat to
Please.
make sure if we did, but I think so. All right, thank you. Merida is asking for internal audit 9.2. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if you could maybe repeat the things that are needed to show internal audit is implemented. I know there were quite a few there, so if it's easier for us to type that in.
Okay. So 9.2, there's really only three things that are still being required for documentation. You have to have documentation of your audit program, evidence that it's implemented, and then evidence of the audit results. You've
Mhm.
always had to have the audit program and the evidence of the audit results. So now the new change here is that you actually have implemented the program that you already had, right? Um, so when we're talking about an audit program and the things that are required, you need to have, when your audits are going to occur, what the um, um, objectives, the scope, and the sorry, went back to all right. Your criteria, scope, and objectives for each one of those audits, right? You're going to show that you're actually meeting that objective, that you're meeting that criteria, that you're meeting the scope for each one of those audits. It can be audit reports themselves. A lot of times that's where I see those things documented. But if you have like a schedule, you're also going to show evidence that you actually met that schedule. For your internal auditors, if you have a requirement that they are receive a specific kind of training, or they have to do so many audits or whatever, you're going to have to show evidence that they have those things. If you have a requirement, and you should, that those auditors not audit their own um, um, processes, things that they own or are innately involved in, then you're going to want to show that those auditors don't have those responsibilities where they are actually doing the audits. Does that make sense? You're just showing evidence that you're meeting the things that you already say you're doing in your program. Okay?
hmm Great. Okay,
Yep.
good. The another question that came in from Michael. Um, does results imply greater, and I may not be capturing this correctly, Michael. Do the results imply greater documentation of what is implemented?
Um, I don't know if it requires greater documentation, but it is starting to push more towards being results oriented and not just improving your system itself. Okay, so you're going to want to show that you're actually reducing your environmental impact, and you typically will be doing that through your objectives, which also, you should be tracking in order to show evidence that you are meeting those objectives. And so I think you can do it that way. It's just make sure that when you're setting objectives, that it's not always or solely to improve something within the system itself, that you should be looking for some of those actual footprint types things, waste, water, energy, pollution levels, whatever it is that you have impacts on.
Great. Okay, thank you. That's awesome. All right,
Mhm.
when you refer to the system, do you have any experience with any software or systems that best fit ISO? I know that's a hard one. We we run into that question with
I mean,
9001 as well.
yeah, and you may have a better answer, Adrian. I don't really have. I mean, every system I look at is different. Everybody uses different types of software. Typically, what I'm seeing are systems that, either are just tracking their document control stuff. So things like SharePoint sites and that kind of thing. Or I'm seeing a corrective action system or an auditing system. And no, I don't really have any recommendations for which ones are better than others. It really depends on what makes the most sense for you and how you're going to use it. I would say that when you're using those systems, to make sure that you can actually edit them so that you're not locked into doing stuff that you don't need to do. Um, and so you work for you instead of you having to work for that system.
hmm And someone just dropped in the chat. Adam mentioned a tool called Procore. I've not heard of
Okay,
that one, but that one might be a good one as well to use.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. Honestly, when I'm doing audits for folks, I'm not really paying attention to the names of the software that they're using. I'm trying to make sure
hmm
that they actually have the information that they need.
That's right.
Um,
And this question is similar from Nick. Are there any resources available to view documentation that meet these new requirements as an example? So maybe somewhere they can get example documents or
To be honest, the changes aren't that significant. So I'm going to say probably not yet. As people start implementing things and putting, I do a Google search for them, but the changes were just made to the standard in April, and so even the registrars are kind of still in the we're getting all of our auditors up to speed mode, and so I don't think they've started creating new documentation yet. And like I said, if it's just a wording change and it still means, what the standard is asking for on the intent side, there's no change to be made. There's really only a couple of little things, and I pointed those out where there's something new or something broader that you need to think about. That adding of the planning of changes piece, it's a whole new element, but all of the requirements for planning of change were already in the standard. It's just a matter of whether or not you're going to create a system if you aren't already involved in your business's planning of change. Then you've got the addition of the objectives within your audits. The biggest thing I think for most people is going to be that broadening of, instead of it just being externally or outsourced processes, it's now that externally provided processes, products, and services. So you're going to have to just look and see if you've got to do some more control there than you had before.
mhm. And Samantha asked the question, will we do a webinar like this for 9001? That's coming soon, Samantha. Yeah, hold tight.
I was
That's
actually
in
going to mention that.
yeah, that's in
Yes.
the works. But Nicola, forgive me if I'm saying that right, asked, could you expand on 9.2i, understanding the concept of controlling external or third-party contracts that impact your EMS? How do you influence their
N-
internal process? 9.2.
9.2.
Uh-huh.
9.2 is internal auditing.
That's right. Yeah.
Are you sure it was 9.2?
External. Yeah, she put 9.2. Maybe Nicole, if you could maybe just drop something in the Q&A or in the chat just to clarify. But maybe you can just expand on for external or third party providers. how they
Yeah,
impact your EMS? Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I think that's she's thinking about 8.1 and what I was just
Mm-hmm.
talking about. Um, but planning piece, where they've expanded that externally provided products and services. Hang on, let me get back there. There, this piece. And your how would they impact your environmental? So remember that with life cycle analysis or life cycle perspective in 14,001, that it's not just what you specifically do at your facility that is important. It's also all of those sub pieces. You're getting materials from somebody. It's not happening in a vacuum. Those folks are having to exert, use energy and water and create waste, and so those come back to you because if you weren't asking for that material, then they wouldn't necessarily be doing that. And so it's not that you have to do the full life cycle analysis where you have numbers that are associated with everything, but if you have any control or influence that you can make over those folks that are providing those goods and services to you, um, then you should exert that influence. And so you can do that through contracting, right? You can require that, anybody who provides you with materials be ISO 14001 certified. That's what the big three automakers have their folks. Most of us are not at their level, and so we really don't have the power to do that. And so you could do things like require that they submit to you information around their product that shows what they're doing to improve their sustainability. Do surveys of that kind of thing. A lot of us are seeing that right now. So we're all being asked, what are your carbon emissions? What are you doing to reduce your waste? What are you doing to eliminate conflict minerals? Those kinds of things. So you have some control or influence, whether it's in the contracting process or whether it is vendor site visits or anything like that, just in the process of discussing, what your shared goals might be, can help you to move forward. The whole point is, that we're all reducing our environmental impact together, and as someone who is purchasing something from somebody else, you have a little bit of influence there over how they do that. So maybe you work with them to come up with something that's less impactful, right? So maybe you have a painting operation, and so you're working with your paint supplier to come up with coatings that take less energy to cure, or less water to actually apply, or something like that. So I know that was a lot, but those are some examples for you.
Um,
Okay.
eh, yeah, Angela, so another question is, are these changes well aligned with the ISO 45001? I know that's being updated as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So yes, for 45,001, it is currently in the draft stage. Um, and it should, um, the changes should be very similar to 45,001 that you're seeing here. So they're going to change the maintain, retain to available. They're going to change, fulfilled a meeting. But they're also going to try and get things so that they're in the same orders, and the sub clauses all meet. That's the big thing. I have not heard one way or the other whether or not there are any um, significant or substantial changes to what the requirements are. Um, the plan currently, from what I've heard, is that 45,001 will come out next year as an update. So they're referring to it as 45,001 2027. So if it's not significant in the same way that the changes here have not been significant, then we'll do a similar kind of webinar then on that. If they are significant, then we'll do more training kinds of things.
Great. Do
Okay.
you know of any tools for performing a gap analysis to the new standard? I know you know, I'm not aware of any specific tool. I know maybe they can develop a checklist, or if they have an internal audit checklist that maybe they can. But what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I have a an Excel spreadsheet tool that I've created that I've used for years, and I've updated it with the new changes. So that's what I use. But as far as, like a product available to, as a something you can just purchase off the shelf, I don't know. There's probably something out there. A lot of times your registrar will have a gap analysis check sheet.
Hmm.
Again, that's something that you can talk about when you contact them about, what the updating is. Ask them if they have a gap tool that they can share with you, because a lot of them do.
Yes. And there are several people that have said they're not able to access the Google Doc web link for the certificate. So please check the chat. Susan has entered the email address IES Zoom user at ncsu.edu. So if you can just send an email to that link, we can follow up.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm also going to drop the form back in as well for folks.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. All right.
Uh, we do offer, Nick, we do offer additional ISO 14001 training. We do overview training. We do internal auditor training. We can also perform internal audits on your behalf. And
Gap
then we help
analysis.
gap analysis. That's right. And then we can do, full 14001 implementation program. So feel free to visit our website. You can reach out to your regional manager for your area, and they'll put you in touch with us to see how we can help. And we do offer open enrollment classes periodically throughout the year in the fall and in the spring.
Yep. And if you have any quick questions that I can answer that, via email, please reach out to me. I tell people all the time, emails are free. I probably shouldn't say that on a webinar this big. Um, but my contact information's on the screen here. Um, as mentioned, for those of you that already deal with quality, 9001 standard is in its final draft stage. And so we're expecting those changes to be released this fall. So
Mhm.
we'll probably do something similar if there's nothing unexpectedly major in that. Adrian or one of our other folks will probably do a similar kind of webinar on that. And as mentioned, 45,001, same thing. It's due out next year sometime unless something changes.
Mhm.
All right.
That's right.
Anything
I
else?
I think that's all. Mary Catherine, unfortunately, we do not offer the lead auditor training at this time. But one of our sister organizations, Georgia Tech, offers that. If you could look into their program. I think they do it on site and virtual. Well, not on site, but face to face and virtual. Yeah, I think I'm looking through Angela. I think that's it. This has been great.
Awesome.
You did a great job. It's been
Thank
very
you.
helpful. So thank you for pulling this together.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah.
Angela. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.